Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this next session on accelerating digital innovation within biopharma. I'm Patel, CEO and co-founder of Bright Insight. We're super excited to have you with us in this discussion. I'll be joined by Diana McKenzie, and I'll introduce her in a minute here, but she's one of the real hands-on execution and thought leaders within digital innovation within biopharma. Our agenda today, I'll do a quick introduction of myself and then jump into the perils of developing technology solution in silos. We'll talk about some of the key important areas when it comes to scaling and creating digital innovation. We'll also make sure that your innovation doesn't stall out after those initial POC phases. And then we'll spend the majority of our time actually sitting down with Diana and learning from her hands-on experience. So just a quick minute on myself. I'm a physician MBA by education, spent many years working for biopharma and medtech as a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group, and then was at Novartis and Amgen, where I had various roles across the businesses. Most recently was founder and head of Amgen's digital health business, where I got to work very closely with Diana. I then moved up to the Bay Area, where I joined a venture-backed company called Doctor on Demand as Chief Commercial Officer, now one of the country's largest video medicine providers. I then, over the last 3 to 4 years, have been working on what we now call Bright Insight. As a quick background on Bright Insight is the leading regulated IoT platform for biopharma and medtech. We're backed by some of the leading investors in digital health, SaaS companies, software as a service companies, as well as healthcare. And what we do is we work with industry-leading companies like AstraZeneca, CSL Behring, Novo Nordisk, and Roche to provide the regulated infrastructure on top of which our customers develop their regulated digital solutions. We have had much success with our customers and have expanded to many of the leading biopharma and medtechs that you see here and others. We've also been recognized with various industry awards, including Google Cloud's Partner of the Year in Healthcare and Life Sciences for the last 2 years, and most recently CB Insight's Digital Health 150 list. Bright Insight is a platform that takes care of all of the privacy, security, regulatory, and quality requirements of building regulated digital solutions. So our customers are building regulated apps, various types of algorithms, including Class 3 software medical devices, various types of digital therapeutics, connected drug delivery devices, regulated wearables, etc., on top of our compliant infrastructure. What we do is we solve for all of those requirements regarding privacy, security, regulatory, and quality by integrating into the source of the data, the patient or the device, and then putting that data on our compliant infrastructure. Because we are built under a quality management system that's compliant to ISO 13485 2016 and all of the various related requirements, we can service Class 3 and combination product intended uses in the US and similar requirements in EU and across the world. We bring that same level of robustness from a data privacy and security perspective. So we're high trust 9.1 and are compliant to GDPR, HIPAA, etc. So by using our infrastructure, we save our customers a lot of time and effort to build and then ultimately commercialize and scale their regulated digital innovation. But let me talk more about what's really required to be successful and what we're seeing in the marketplace when it comes to digital innovation. The first thing to note is that just because you're innovating and developing technology doesn't mean you're taking the right approach. In fact, there's a lot of good examples of the wrong approach in other industries. Let's think about the GPS for a second. If you pause and think about your car, it probably comes with built-in GPS. Question is, how many of you actually use that? Percentages is actually quite small. This has been surveyed, and less than 10% of users actually use the GPS in their cars. The majority of us use our phones, GPS that's built into Google Maps, Apple Map function, etc. And this is a great example where the car companies spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars over many years to try to innovate their own GPS without pausing and thinking about who they were really servicing, the driver, and what was the driver's ecosystem, and really thinking about that. Now you have car companies really scrambling and spending lots of money to integrate into Google Play and Android's car function and so forth. So this is an example of taking a really siloed approach and then having to flush that money down the toilet. Now really try to compete and catch up by partnering with the phone companies and their operating systems. As another example, let's think about how you consume your video. These numbers are a little bit dated, and I think the numbers are even more extreme if you saw that today. But when you look at what Netflix did versus DirecTV, you had Netflix that really thought about its user and said, hey, we're going to give them the content where they want it, when they want it, how they want it. So they really made this transition over to streaming, and it really cut the cord literally for their users. So now you can watch Netflix on your phone, on your tablet, on the go, when you're traveling, etc. The cable companies, they focus much more on incremental innovation in their own narrow ecosystem by doing things like letting you record multiple shows at once or watch different shows in different TVs in your house. But fundamentally, they kept the amount of content you can see limited, and they kept the places you can see that content limited, primarily to your home. And now, of course, they've all tried to catch up to Netflix and are really struggling to do that. Just cover one other quick example, and that's on the payment side. All of you probably have a banking app for your bank that you may download and use. But the reality is, though, the majority of you probably use that in a very limited fashion to check what your balance is, maybe to make a deposit of a check. The majority of financial transactions happen on other infrastructure like PayPal and Venmo. And the reason is they took a very ecosystem approach. They said, how do we integrate across the users of payment services instead of only thinking about how do I interface with my bank and only make it easy to connect with other users that use my bank services. For example, transferring money to a friend or a family member who also uses the same bank that you're using, versus Venmo lets you transfer money to virtually anyone. So hopefully these all give you an example of what it's like to innovate and get that innovation right versus spending a lot of money on innovation and getting that innovation wrong. And the key thing that we're learning is that integration into the user and the broader ecosystem is paramount to achieving scale and really creating value. Let's turn to healthcare for a second. These numbers should not be a surprise to anyone. When you see the studies, are still quite shocking to see the numbers. In the US, doctors typically have an average of less than 15 minutes to see each patient. And their entire workflow is driven out of their electronic medical record system, their EMR system. If you can't integrate into your doctor's EMR system, it's going to be really hard for you to scale your innovation. That's why all drugs are prescribed from the EMR. The same thing needs to happen from a digital solution perspective. If your digital therapeutic or other digital solution can't integrate with the prescription management system, your therapies won't be prescribed. It's just unrealistic to expect a physician to close down their EMR, log into your company's portal, remember that password, go through all the privacy requirements, and then find that patient's data, no matter how valuable, and use that into their decision making. So you have to really think about, how do I integrate into the workflow of the provider? And the same thing happens when you think about patients. The majority of patients that are, especially on the elderly side, have multiple conditions with many therapies per condition. In the US, for patients that are between 50 and 64, they have an average of 20 prescriptions a year. If you look at a common chronic condition like insulin-dependent diabetes, less than 5% of those patients get their therapies from one drug company. Most of them are using multiple companies. So again, as you think about your digital innovation, are you really solving your problem, or are you solving the experience for your patients? So before you build a silo, you have to think about all the potential integration points for your solution and the data that it's creating. In the US alone, you have digital health solution, you have literally 500-600 different payers, many thousands of disease management programs, and over 4,000 health systems. So just thinking about those integration points alone to do, no matter how big of a company you are, how great of a solution you have, is just not a scalable approach. So how do you ensure that your digital health solutions don't end up in a silo? So first, we want you to hear what mistakes have been made by the top 20 biopharma, many of them top 20 biopharma companies. I'll give you a second to just read these quotes. As you see, there are many challenges and many mistakes have been made, but we can learn from those that are around regulatory, around scalability, around building silos, and around not thinking through that after you've developed innovation, you have to do the maintenance of that innovation. So I'll close with just a couple of recommendations before we switch the conversation here to connecting with Diana. So first is ensure that you have the ecosystem approach at the core of your digital solution. Secondly, free up your company's investments to really focus on the actual innovation versus all the underlying infrastructure that you're going to need. For that underlying infrastructure, really think about finding the best-in-class technology leaders to work with. And lastly, make sure that you bring the same level of robustness that you do to your drugs and devices to your digital solutions. And that means privacy, security, regulatory, and quality infrastructure, so that you don't either put your organization at risk or limit the ultimate impact of your innovation. So with that, let me introduce Diana McKenzie. Diana has been a great friend and a partner for me, and she's an incredible leader. She is a board member of leading digital health companies, both private and public. She's on the board of one of the leading biopharma companies, Vertex, and she spent her hands-on years as SVP and CIO of both Workday as well as Amgen. Diana, welcome to the conversation here.
Thanks, Cal. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Diana, tell me, first of all, where are you taking this call from today? And maybe share a little bit more about your background as a board member, as a technology leader, so that we have that context for the audience.
Sure. So first of all, I'm in the East Bay in California. Probably the best way to describe my background, I spent 30 years of my career in life sciences with two different life science companies, Eli Lilly and Amgen. In the last 5 years, most of those years were in technology roles. The last 5 at Amgen, I had the opportunity to work with you, Cal, first as the Chief Information Officer, and then when you moved into Leader for Digital Health to partner with you in building out our digital health capability. I learned a lot and really loved that role. As a matter of fact, would have come to work every day just to do digital health. What I learned though, and what I recognized is at that time, I didn't really understand what it took to run a software company. And I wasn't certain I was going to learn everything I wanted to know about running a software company by trying to build one inside Amgen. So about the same time you moved on, Cal, I moved on and took the role at Workday, which was just a tremendous opportunity to learn how great software companies run from the inside out. My intent always was, however, to go back to healthcare and blend my background in life sciences and healthcare with my understanding of software companies, and ideally use that as board members, as a board member, and also to advise new startups that we're doing really exciting work in this space, which what bring me here today with you, Cal.
That's great. I think you provided just a really unique set of experiences to help inform this conversation. So maybe let's talk about that. You know, from your Lilly and Amgen days to where you are today. That's sort of covered this transition of healthcare to really see and start to adopt regulated digital innovation. How do you think about traditional IT leaders and their roles and responsibilities to now, chief digital officers and what that role is in the intersection of the two?
It's a great question, and I get the question a lot. I do believe there is an acceleration, if you will, with this idea of Chief Digital Officer. And there's an interesting blend that's happening with the Chief Information Officer role, Chief Digital Officer role, Chief Product Officer role, and Chief Technology Officer. And often it really does depend on the company and how the company is structured when it comes to which of those roles exist and how they work together. But to simplify it, I think about it as a Venn diagram with two circles that overlap. One of the circles is the outside in, and the outside in takes on a product focus and ideally thinks about the product from the lens of the customer, which is in the conversation we're having right now, the patient, and then how that product shows up for that customer in the healthcare ecosystem. So the person who's responsible from a Chief Digital Officer perspective takes responsibility for the outside in circle, if you will. The inside out circle, despite where a lot of conversation has evolved over the past several years is a critically important element. That chief information officer is probably more critical today than it ever has been, because from the inside out, this is where you actually are responsible for running and operating the company, for helping the company build the core products on which oftentimes the digital element is added, to measure how the company's responding to the market, to adapt, compete, and continue to grow the firm in a very highly regulated, compliance-oriented environment. So when you have those two circles come together, there's the portion in the middle where the overlap occurs. And that's where, if a company gets the relationship right between these two roles, really good things can happen in this product development space. It becomes, in essence, what I would call the organizational API that makes sure that the data we're capturing from those patients, from that healthcare ecosystem about our products and how our products are performing, is making its way back into the company. And conversely, the company is able to take advantage of that data, learn about the product performance, and then push the right kinds of changes back out to the product. If those two roles aren't operating in complete sync with one another, that data exchange doesn't happen, and ultimately neither side can be as successful as it needs to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So thanks for describing that from a roles perspective. What about from an IT systems perspective? So how do you ensure, just to use your word there, on the ecosystem, that the solutions that are being built and the data that is being created by a pharma or medtech company can really integrate into the broader ecosystem so that it can really deliver that value for both the end user and the company?
So I think about this, there's probably 6 considerations, this organization structure, whether it's one person or multiple roles, needs to think about. And the first of those, as we've all learned from the very first day, we took our first computer science class, right, was you're focused on an outcome. We're not focused on the technology. So the outcome here, again, in this industry, is all about the patient, making sure that we're delivering patient outcomes, which ultimately benefits the entire healthcare ecosystem. So if we start with that as the first objective and make sure we stay focused on that, then the next question is, how does that patient journey function with our product in that healthcare ecosystem? And do we understand every step of the patient journey? And do we understand the ins and outs and how that patient interacts with the different players in that healthcare ecosystem? So that's sort of consideration number 2. And then at that point, it becomes important to think about, at each step of that journey, what is the product we need to develop as the biopharma provider, and what ecosystem already exists that we need to be able to plug into to minimize friction for the patient and improve the data exchange that we have between that ecosystem and our company. And then how do we attract the talent that we need, who understands enough about the product outcomes, the compliance environment we operate in, technology, user experience, journey mapping, all of that. That is a big talent focus for so many companies right now. And there's, I think, a general agreement that there just simply isn't enough talent out there to go around for companies in this space. So how do you think about making sure you're focusing your talent on the areas that give you the most competitive advantage? And Cal, you had that in your previous slide. And then speed to market. So again, as you think about the product you need to go, to meet that patient outcome, are you able to deliver the product at a pace that makes it possible for you to be competitive in the marketplace? Again, recognizing even with COVID, that the acceleration of digital in healthcare has hit an inflection point. And so the competition, or the ability to compete, is going to grow increasingly more difficult, because so many companies are focused now and recognize that this is the only way they're going to be able to differentiate their products moving forward. There's a regulatory compliance element to this. Do we understand, and can we keep current with the compliance elements of this? And then lastly, cost. What's the return on investment with respect to what you build? And is it ultimately a cost that the company is willing to continue to invest in because it's growing the business and coming back around to that first point, helping you meet those patient outcomes?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Certainly resonates with my experience along your 6 points there. How do you think about, along that whole chain you described, buy versus build. Which capabilities, which infrastructure do you really see as something you need to have, you're building in-house because it does drive that competitive differentiation, versus what are the things that actually competitive advantage means you should be buying, so that you can focus your resources on the right things and you can leverage the stronger capability of a partner.
Yeah, I think this is hard for some organizations, especially if you already have an organization that has a lot of really strong, rich talent, because ultimately they love to build product. That's what they want to do. So I think that the challenge here for companies that already have a strong talent base, or the opportunity for companies that are just starting to move into this space, is to think about what truly differentiates you. And if you can draw a line sort of at that application layer to support only those elements of the product that differentiate you in the marketplace, and find a partner to do everything else that needs to be done, you then get the opportunity to focus your talent only on that product differentiation, making sure you're delivering really high quality customer support, because ultimately that's a major differentiator as well. And then lastly, you're able to allocate that talent to understanding the data insights that are coming back from that application layer, so that you can use that data to make the product better, differentiate it more, but also inform the company surrounding all the other elements critical to the growth of the company. That then also gives you the ability to take some of your team and ensure that they're really good at partner and relationship management. So as you go find others that can help you build out that ecosystem or leverage elements of the ecosystem that have already been built, it really becomes a responsibility for ensuring you've picked the right partner, you're working with that partner well, and they're supporting your objectives in delivering those patient outcomes, which is your core focus and mission.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's one of the hardest things that, as you pointed out, that companies struggle with, because I think there's also a cultural element with pharma and medtech to sort of not made here, and that comes into a lot of this. And I think what we see is oftentimes companies don't appreciate that when you're talking about regulated digital health, this software is part of your ultimate regulated product. It's going to the regulatory bodies. It's not software that's helping you run your business or run your manufacturing plant or your supply chain. This is actually software that in itself is a medical device. And that's just a very different level of capability and requirements. And maybe that it's a good transition to my next question, which is, again, as a CIO, you're well aware that that healthcare, unfortunately, is the most targeted area from a security and nefarious hacking perspective. How should leaders think about securing the data that they're going to be taking on about their patients in a regulated digital health environment?
Well, I'm going to start in the same place, Cal, that I started with the answer to the last two questions, and that is putting the patient in the center of everything that we do. When we do that, it then causes us to take a step back and say, how do I make sure that I'm doing everything in my power to ensure that I'm protecting that patient and advancing the outcome I'm trying to drive? And when I think about it from that perspective, I really do need to make sure that I'm securing the product. I need to make sure I'm securing the data. And I want to make sure that there's never a question about the integrity of that chain of custody, if you will, as the data flows to the right or to the left of the experience or the interaction with the customer. One thing that's really great about where we are today, in contrast to where you and I found ourselves back when we started the digital health effort at Amgen, is there are a lot of organizations that have identified where they can start to fill in key gaps that exist in this compliance, security, regulatory infrastructure. Electronic health record companies have made their products more API-able, if you will, to make it easier to connect the data sources between them. Because it's a different space today than it was when we started 5 years ago, no different, quite frankly, than adverse event reporting software was when I graduated from college and I wrote the system for Eli Lilly and Company with the team. And we eventually ended up buying software that someone else wrote, which was wonderful. We're seeing that same evolution happen in this space. So those cloud infrastructure platform as a service providers that are emerging are really important for all IT organizations and chief digital teams to pay attention to, because they let you focus, maintain your focus on the application layer so you don't have to build out and maintain that very heavy, expensive infrastructure. In addition, as those network effects grow and more players start to use those cloud providers, you then have the opportunity for more members of the ecosystem to adapt to those interfaces, if you will, to those APIs. And you're not beating down doors again. I think how you had this in your deck, trying to get a player to work with you because you're already working with a platform that's trusted and validated and secured and everyone's comfortable with. And ultimately, it's all about mitigating risk and taking on risk only where you're confident that you are completely in control of that risk. And in cases where you don't necessarily want to take on risk for the whole soup to nuts infrastructure from the application down to the lowest layer, you have the opportunity, back to that partnership management capability you want to build in your team, to do the trust but verify. There's audits, there's all kinds of documentation that providers have to create for you to validate that you are indeed using an infrastructure that you can trust, but you can rely on them to keep current with security, privacy regulations, and you can stay focused on your patients.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I'll say again, it's great to see that a lot of companies are understanding what you just described and are moving towards that type of approach with their digital innovation. I think there's a lot of companies that still have to catch up there, where we're surprised to see that they're willing to take patient data without saying what's the highest level of robustness we should be adhering to, right around high trust, NIST cybersecurity, ISO 27001, et cetera. To your point, well-established requirements that help ensure that you're doing everything you can to protect the patient's data. So I think it's great we're talking about that and really encouraging folks to start with a security first mindset when they move into digital innovation. I know we only have about a minute or two left here, Diana. So maybe let's close on hearing about what advice, given again your amazing set of experiences, what advice would you give to a CIO today or a digital leader today in a biopharma medtech company that's really trying to help their companies really go through a massive transition from being a traditional drug or device company to being one where digital is actually at the heart of their solutions?
I'd go back to where we started with this conversation here as we think about the roles that exist and what the responsibilities are for the different individuals, whether, again, that's one role or multiple roles. Ultimately, your ability to be successful is completely dependent upon the buy-in of the executive team and what you're doing. If the company you work for is really serious about taking a product, wrapping it with digital capabilities, and making it available to patients, it's not just a technology conversation as we've discussed here. It really is a business strategy conversation. And it's one in which all the members of the executive team have to be engaged, and they have to understand what changes this is going to drive for the company proper with respect to how products get developed, how they get integrated, how they get supported, and who the partners are in the ecosystem. If you start there and ensure that you've got complete buy-in to the objectives that have been set forth for a digital strategy in this space, you're likely to be successful. If that buy-in is not there, then it's a very difficult path to move down and much less likely to be successful.
Diana, thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure to connect with you, and really appreciate all the perspectives and advice you offered to all of us here today in the conversation.
My pleasure, Cal. Thanks so much.